Okay, then the other half of that equation was getting a student to talk to an administrator or a professor in terms of talking about accommodations. So I know you don't get involved in throwing down and things like that. You're more of the tech dude, which I can appreciate and respect. But in your experience, what major problems has caused a situation like that to occur? What I mean by that is the professor saying, no, you can't have such and such accommodations, or no, you can't have, say, extensions, even when the student doesn't have access to the material they need?
I think sometimes it just comes down to a bit of a misunderstanding where a student may not necessarily understand how an accommodation should be used or accessed, or a professor is just misinterpreting what the structure or the student's responsibility is in accessing or advocating for themselves in a certain way. So trying to think of a good example, and maybe I can circle back to that. We're there as much as an advocate for the student. We're also there to be an advocate for the faculty and providing them assistance with what the accommodation process looks like. And I mean, just with the nature of sort of faculty and in higher ed, there's a lot of changeover. There's a lot of contract faculty that come in, and sometimes the onboarding processes where they might be made aware of things like, policies around accommodation or around, what SAS actually does to help support the faculty in addition to the student. Some of that stuff might get lost. And I mean, most faculty members have the student's best interest in mind, and they want the student to succeed, and they just need some support in providing them, what does accommodation actually look like? So we continually review how we interact with the message that we put out there in terms of providing support to make sure that the faculty understand we're very much allies for them as well.
For sure. You want to tell them where you're coming from and what your purpose is. And I talk a lot on this show with previous guests about ignorance and how that, from both sides of the equation, but more so with professors and school administrators not understanding how or what exactly is involved in physical disability accommodations, where they're coming from. Last week, I talked about some professors seeing accommodations as giving the student with the disability an unfair advantage. Well, if they have more time, or if they have this access to this, then they'll be able to write better than a fully bodied student who's able to sit down and do things quote unquote normally.
Right.
And you have to explain to them, both student and advocate, if need be, that that's not the case at all, right?
And every accommodation that's put in place for a student is based on need, right? It's not something that's fabricated. It's not something that's just kind of made up, or something that we're putting in place because we think it might be nice for a student to have. It's a need, and it's been validated and verified, and it's something that's subject to review too. If it's one of those things that if a need is not being met, that's where an accommodation review comes in. And the accommodation plan can be very fluid in the sense that it might change over time. And that can be adapted.
For sure. And there's two sides of the coin for that, because if a student with a physical disability is taking advantage of an accommodation and bending it, isn't that subject to review as well? Like, let's just take an example of extensions. If a professor or any other school administrator knowingly has the knowledge that the student is, let's just say, taking advantage more so than usual, and they've shown that they are capable of producing great work in a timeline-driven environment, and the student 3-4 times says, oh, can I have an extension? And the extension, oh, can I have another 2 weeks on that?
Right.
That's obviously subject to review as well, right?
And, the extensions are interesting because that's one of the comments that we often get as feedback from faculty is, the student comes up right at the last minute and asks for an extension, and they've done it multiple times. And, what do I do? How do I respond to this? And there's been instances where the students have been advised when they're actually making a request for an extension, it needs to be done in a timely manner, but providing the professor with here's a rough guide of what I've actually done so far to know that I'm not just trying to pull the wool over your eyes. I have been working on it, but for, extenuating circumstances, this is the nature of why I'm requesting this. And in that case, most professors are okay with things, right?
Yeah, and that's been my experience too.
In an appropriate way, right?
Yeah, for sure. If you can,
I mean, there are sometimes things that you just can't control. Like sometimes technology fails, and sometimes there's issues where you can't access things, and you don't realize it until it's time to submit a paper, right? So that's one of those things where profs do have your best interest in mind. When there are barriers, whether they're known ahead of time or not, sometimes the profs are there to help.
For sure, and they're much more willing to accept if you can, let's just say, provide something tangible and explain what happened, right? As opposed to just coming to them on the deadline instead of 3 days before and saying, hey, can I have an extension on this?
Yep, exactly.
But again, it's a case-by-case basis depending on the accommodation as well. Craving even more disability content? Links to the full podcast episode and other great clips are only a tap or click away, just waiting for you in the description.